Hello? Yeah. Okay. Great. I just need to take a moment to look at all of you. And there's over 100 coming in on Zoom. Good. Welcome everybody here, both in the auditorium and on Zoom. This is the 45th Luther Lecture. My name is Dr. Brenda Anderson. My pronouns are she and her, and I am a settler on Treaty 4 territory. I teach in the Department of Gender, Religion, and Critical Studies. And as chair of the Luther Lecture Committee, I have the privilege of being your MC tonight. So the Luther Lecture has been one of our college's flagship endeavors starting in 1977. And it was actually the Luther Lecture series that I began to think of myself as a Luther College somebody, because they handed me a pile of programs and said, here, hand these out. And that meant something to me. So I invite you to look at your program right now, at all of the prestigious scholars and leaders who have spoken here over the years. When our committee selects a person to invite them to our community, we really strive to look for cutting-edge scholarly work, but also compassionate speakers who urge us to create a more just and justice-seeking world. So very clearly, our speaker this evening, the very Reverend Dr. Carmen Lansdowne, fits this to a T. So I have just a few housekeeping items. Many of you are accustomed to our dear elder in residence, Dr. Elder Lorna Standing Ready, beginning our events in a good way with a blessing. However, her presence was requested by her chief from White Bear to attend a national conference with all the chiefs of the country and their advisors and elders. So she is honoring that request and is currently in Edmonton this evening. But in place of being here in person, she has prayed and smudged on her own and has asked the Creator to be with Carmen as she delivers her talk, and to us as well as we are listening, that we might have open minds and generous hearts. For this evening, we have a few introductory remarks prior to Dr. Lansdowne's talk, and then her talk. And we'll have about 15 minutes for a Q&A, and I'll monitor the online questions as well as any from the floor here this evening. And then it's our tradition to invite you to a reception afterwards, which is just down the hallway. And maybe most importantly, there are washrooms just down the same hallway, and we have gender-neutral washrooms downstairs as well. So welcome to this very exciting evening to listen to Carmen. It is now my sincere pleasure to invite our newly minted president of Luther College, Dr. Tom Phoenix, who will offer our land acknowledgement and a more formal welcome on behalf of Luther College. Tom?
Still scratching things out last minute. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Luther College, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2025 Luther Lecture. This lecture is the signature event in our academic calendar. It brings us together as a community of learners, people of faith, people of conscience, with pressing issues of our time. We begin by acknowledging that Luther College is on Treaty 4 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and on the homeland of the Métis. We recognize the deep and enduring relationships that Indigenous peoples have with the land, relationships that predate treaty and continue today. As we gather here, we also are probably reflecting about tomorrow, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. This day reminds us of the painful history and lasting impacts of the residential school system, and it calls us to remember the children who never returned home, their survivors, and their families, and their communities. We acknowledge our acknowledgement of the Treaty 4 territory is not only about place, it's also about responsibility. It challenges us to listen, to learn, and to act in ways that honor the treaty commitments, supporting healing, justice, and reconciliation. This acknowledgement also challenges us to build relationships that are marked by respect, humility, and solidarity. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to express our deep gratitude to the Kurtz family. The James Kurtz Memorial Endowment makes this Luther Lecture possible. Their family vision ensures that our community can gather to think bravely, to ask hard questions, and to imagine a better world for all of us. This evening, we are honored to welcome our Luther lecturer, the very Reverend Dr. Carmen Lansdowne. Dr. Lansdowne is a respected leader in the United Church of Canada, a scholar, a minister, and a committed voice for intercultural ministry and justice. She brings together a remarkable range of experience in the academy, ministry, and community service, while also grounding her work in her identity as a member of the Heiltsuk First Nation. Her lecture this evening, Turning Ourselves Inside Out for Each Other, Why Intercultural Ministry Matters, challenges us to think deeply about what it means to be a church, a community, and a society in the 21st century. She invites us to imagine new ways of being together across cultures, traditions, differences, especially at a time when many communities continue to face marginalization. Dr. Lansdowne, thank you for being with us tonight and for sharing your insights and your vision. We're eager to hear your reflections and to continue our conversations that flow from them. I would now, I was going to introduce the next person as well. Cameron, yeah. So I'd now like to invite Cameron Fraser from the United Church for the introduction of our 2025 Luther Lecture speaker.
Thank you so much to the lecture committee for inviting me to play this role. My name is Cameron Fraser, and I'm a minister with the United Church of Canada, and I currently serve as the Director of Growth and Ministry Development in the United Church of Canada's denominational office, which we call the General Council Office. Those offices are in Toronto, but I work from my home in the Cathedral neighborhood here in Regina. And as I do most of my work online, way back in 2023, when I was first brought into this role, I was brought to Toronto to do some orientation and learn how to open the laptop that they had sent me by mail a week early. And in a break from there, I'm in the hallway, and suddenly down the leader. This is a pretty big church polity, church geek like myself. I had met past models, first model, and the 43rd model. This is the 44th. That was the highest score that a model had received up until that point. She's smart, she's articulate, she was incredibly cool. She came up and introduced herself and said, I hope we will get to work with each other. And I thought that was an incredibly wonderful and polite thing to say, and I'm so honored, and I really hope that that's true. And within 2 months, I had been tasked as part of my role to join her in the Flourishing Project, as she traveled across Canada to invite our communities into the disciplines of futurism, futures thinking, of imaginative postures towards our world, and to imagine human flourishing as the benchmark by which we build communities both within and beyond the church. Carmen's term as moderator will be remembered for her workshops, her book clubs, her investment in young leaders in the church, the constant throwing up her hands and exclaiming, how fabulous, when things go slightly different than expected. For the enigmatic questions around her thick purple glasses. Are they purple? Are they blue? It depends on what light you're in, friends. Today, I think they're purple. But in the reception hall, it's anyone's guess. And I'm here for it. It's going to be wonderful. And for reminding us that we do our best work as churches and as communities when we are following visions and dreams and not trying to solve problems. She has an incredibly impressive formal biography that you can read on her website. But when we were talking about this, we said, that's not what I should read to you today. Another mark of Carmen's time as moderator was her commitment to young people, her commitment to say yes as often as possible when youth asked her to be with them. And one of those came in the form of inviting a 17-year-old in the church named Eli Canhigh from Winnipeg, whose grandpa is here today, to rewrite her formal biography in a way that people might find a little more exciting. So friends, if your shoes are not already tied, please do so, because this will blow your socks off. The words of Eli Canhigh introducing our just now former moderator, the Very Reverend Dr. Carmen Lansdowne, mother, spouse, friend, ice cream critic. Oh, and also once served as the moderator of the United Church of Canada, allegedly. Instead of listing all the wonderful things of which Carmen Lansdowne is capable, it is prudent to include the far shorter list of things she is unable to do. Maintaining a healthy sleep schedule and walking downstairs are both areas in which, tragically, the now former moderator comes up below average. One disgruntled United Church member, her son Gabriel, shared that her greatest weakness may be staying at home. Ouch. Other than that, however, she's got just about every box checked. Carmen was the first Indigenous woman to hold the role of United Church moderator. She's attended school longer than most youth and young adults have been alive, and has been praised as an incredibly talented churchy person. It's been rumored that she recently took a consultative role in NASA's Lazarus Project initiative and worked undercover in the San Pedro Alligator Wrestling League for 7 years. But you might need to fact check those last two. These are just a few of the outstanding feats Carmen has accomplished over her life, and if they are any indicator, the church is blessed to be gifted with her ministry. On that one, you need not fact check. It is 100% true. All in all, Carmen Lansdowne is an intelligent, wise, educated, versatile, sharp-tongued, strong, swagger, funky-licious pastor and preacher, scholar and speaker who is absolutely goated with the sauce. And if anyone would ever hope to bribe her, definitely avoid bringing Carmen fancy ice cream, as she will ravage your ego and destroy your soul. Or at least she will tease you for liking bougie ice cream flavors. Friends, this year she published Wearing a Broken Indigene Heart on the Sleeve of Christian Mission, a book in which she searches out the answers to the question, if Indigenous hearts are broken by Christianity, what in Christian theology is life-giving at all? Copies of that book are for sale this evening, and a launch of that book is being held tomorrow at Broadway United Church at 7 p.m. I remain in awe, I remain a fan, and I am privileged to have become a friend to the person I am deeply honored to welcome to the stage, the Very Reverend Dr. Carmen Lansdowne. Welcome to Regina.
So, friends, it has become my practice over the last several years when I'm speaking or preaching in public in order to facilitate more accessibility, to describe how I show up physically for those who might be blind or sight impaired. And so tonight I have my the longest hair that I've had since I was elected moderator, which is normally shoulder length, but pulled back in a barrette. I'm wearing some beautiful carved earrings that are kind of like in a spiral silver shape. The infamous glasses, are they purple? Are they blue? Sort of mustard yellow V-neck short sleeve top, and these fantastic pants that have a multicolored form line sort of stylized design on them that represent my West Coast culture. And I forgot my fabulous shoes. I have these great like red high heel wedge sandals that I was going to wear, and I went to pull them out of my backpack, and I had taken the bag with my bright fluorescent orange sneakers with me to the university. How fabulous. So I'm wearing the black penny loafers that I wore to dinner. And I'm wearing lipstick because not just for fashion, but because I've learned that it helps lip reading easier for those who might be hard of hearing. It's my very deep pleasure to be with you here in Regina for this 2025 Luther Lecture. Being only 2 years younger no, 2 years older than the lecture itself. I was more than just a little intimidated to see the list of previous lecturers, theologians and philosophers whom I studied in undergraduate and then graduate studies. Where to start? There is so much packed into the title that I designed for this talk. I think when I was coordinating with Rebecca and Dean Eberts and the lecture committee here at Luther, I had a lot of pent-up academic energy. I'm joining the faculty at Emmanuel College in Victoria University at the University of Toronto in January, but I have not worked full-time in the academy since the year after I finished my coursework at the Graduate Theological Union. And I've always done all of my reading and research and writing off the side of my desk. And I think I tried to cram like a book's worth of ideas into my idea for this talk. I've had time to sit with my books for the first time in nearly a decade, to think and to read and to write. And I realize I probably could have just chosen one idea out of my talk instead of trying to marry three together. But then again, I do have a PhD in interdisciplinary studies, so I imagine it's just in my nature to try and weave concepts together. The title for my talk is a blend of three different concepts. Dutch theologian J.C. Hoekendijk wrote a book in 1964 called The Church Inside Out that was about Christian mission and how we tend to be too self-focused as churches. We do a sort of ecclesial navel gazing, and we have a preoccupation with our own survival when we should be focused on out there in the world that God loves. The for each other in my title came from Dietrich Bonhoeffer's book, Life Together, the classic exploration of faith in the community, written in 1939. And the why intercultural ministry matters comes from the United Church of Canada's 2006 and 2012 decisions to move past multiculturalism to become an intentionally intercultural church. I think the first two are sort of self-explanatory, at least for now, in terms of wanting to look from the inside out and to live for each other. But I'll take some time to explain what I mean by intercultural ministry. As a young adult leader, I was present at the 2006 meeting of the United Church General Council that took place in Thunder Bay. It was the first time I'd heard the term intercultural, and it made a lot of sense to me. I think that actually might have been where I met Moses. What I remember was staff and volunteers who were leading the church in this direction talked about how the recent decades that celebrated a diversity of cultures in Canada had created a reality of multiculturalism, where at worst, diversity of culture was tolerated and, more hopefully, was often celebrated. But the challenge with multiculturalism, the way I remember them explaining it then, was that it allowed for the church and society to continue to push racialized and other oppressed peoples to the margins despite best intentions. The cishet white supremacy that persists in the global north was not moved to equity or justice through multiculturalism. Interculturalism, on the other hand, required intimacy, vulnerability, courage, and relationship. It was not simply tolerating, recognizing, or even celebrating the other. It was the openness to be transformed by otherness. The current definition of interculturalism as it's shared on the United Church website is, it means living together with a respectful awareness of each other's differences. We do this by examining ourselves, building relationships, and distributing power fairly. And I'll get more into that at the end of this talk. But first, the world is a raging dumpster fire right now. And I think we can all agree on that, right? Unless you are part of the 1% of the 1% of the world's population that earns an average of $36 million per year in annual income, with the resources to weather the multiple existential crises, and probably with property assets in multiple countries and the resources to flee instability to get somewhere more stable if push came to shove, life has been getting increasingly challenging for common people, even in G7 countries. I'm sure I don't have to remind anyone in this room of the multiple existential threats, but let's, shall we? Just a few. The 12,000 nuclear weapons scattered across the planet. the climate emergency and its attendant severe weather events, the potential for more and more frequent catastrophic global pandemics, uncontrolled artificial intelligence, ecological collapse, misuse of technology, especially biotech and nanotech, but also social media, large-scale geoengineering accidents, and the rise of fascism and geopolitical upheavals. We have major ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, the genocide in Gaza, the war in Ukraine, the humanitarian crisis that persists in Syria, the civil war and genocide in Sudan with 12 million of its population displaced and over 50% of its 30 million people in need of humanitarian aid. That doesn't even make the news cycle except for the odd newspaper article. The civil war in Congo, an escalation of the Rwandan genocide from the mid-1990s that has resulted in nearly 6 million deaths we don't talk about, despite the fact that it's the deadliest conflict in human history since World War II. When I was finishing my PhD at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, inspired by the work of Osage theologian Tink Tinker, I made the case, like him, that all Indigenous theology is political theology. Wikipedia defines politics from the ancient Greek politika, affairs of the cities, as the set of activities that are associated with making decisions in groups or other forms of power relations among individuals, such as the distribution of status or resources. Wikipedia is probably not the best place to source definitions, but that one is good and simple and accurate. The reason that all Indigenous theology is political theology is twofold. One, Indigenous cultures are inherently relational, and so, strictly speaking, inherently political. And two, after centuries of colonization and oppression, the very fact of existing as an Indigenous person in colonized North America is a political existence, and as such informs every part of our lives. At the conclusion of my dissertation defense in 2016, my committee said that they understood why I'd focused on constructing my own Indigenous political theology of mission, but they wondered if there wasn't more inquiry I could do into looking at the synergies and differences between the mid-century German political theologians and my own work. I think that's why the political theologians of the mid-20th century appeal to me so much right now in my own studies, and it's a real gift to be here with you tonight to start thinking through this together. What we've inherited, especially from the German theologians of the mid-20th century, is a commitment to figuring out together what to do with our societies when they allow for great evil. Both Jürgen Moltmann in his The Crucified God and Johann Metz, one of the founders of political theology, in his book A Passion for God, struggled with the dissonance created by living through the period of the Second World War as Christians. Younger than well-known Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the prophetic and committed activist theologian who worked through the Second World War, Moltmann and Metz were just coming of age through the worst of the war. As young adults, they were left with the task, as German theologians, of thinking through the intersections of human relationships, the sacred dimensions of political life, which in their time included theodicy, or how to rationalize the existence of evil, writ large. It's easy for us, with nearly a century of perspective behind us, to assume that once the war came to an end, people realized the full magnitude of what had happened both in Germany and in Soviet Russia. And that's another thing that we don't talk about. We talk about the Holocaust and the extermination of 6 million Jews, and there was nearly 20 million killed in the Soviet Union. Especially in light of the fact that the Geneva Conventions were expanded immediately after the war. That does not necessarily mean, however, that they were in response to the Holocaust, although we associate that as something that happened now. In fact, even though the realities of what took place in Europe became evident immediately after the war, it took the persistence of polemical scholar Raoul Hilberg and others to insist that the subject of his study, the destruction of European Jews, to start to force public discussion of what, until he started to crack open the academy and public closed doors on the subject, had been considered taboo. They didn't talk about the extermination of the Jews, they just talked about the war. Without wanting to fall too far into that rabbit hole right this moment, because this lecture isn't only about history, I want to turn then to the German and largely German Roman Catholic response of the mid-century political theologians. When I first read Moltmann's The Crucified God, I was so energized about his thesis that when we refuse to see the ways we oppress the other, even to the point of death or crucifixion, that we are re-crucifying God. The very first sermon I preached as a student minister was basically a 45-minute lecture explaining all the ways I saw this happening in the world, 2.5 years after 9/11. My mother, who had come proudly to see my first sermon, took me by the elbow as we moved into the hall for coffee time and whispered through closed teeth into my ear, "That was not a sermon, that was a hostage situation. Don't ever do that to people again." I suppose that's why I'm better suited as an academic than in pastoral ministry, although I have learned to preach a good 15-minute sermon. Johann Metz was even more explicit than Moltmann. In A Passion for God, he explained that people who lived through the Holocaust failed to see what was happening right in front of them. He called this failing the test of Auschwitz. Like Moltmann, he encourages the church to be ever vigilant, to recognize oppression and injustice in our time, so that we may not, too, fail the test of Auschwitz. Although I never specialized in reading the full works of German-American theologian Paul Tillich, I also want to bring his small but mighty volume, Love, Power, and Justice, into the mix. It deeply informed my own theological constructions for my Master of Theology and PhD research. Tillich was a Lutheran priest and theologian who was one of the early resistors to the Nazi regime and moved to the United States in 1933 at the age of 47. Watching the rise of fascism in his native Germany, he also had much to say on sin and oppression. In Love, Power, and Justice, he explains that there are 3 types of power: the inherent power of simply being that is granted to each person through life, the power to act on behalf of another, or benevolence, and the compulsion to dominate. Tillich argues in that book that it's easy to name the compulsion to dominate as sin. But the slippery slope of human sin actually lies in the power dynamics related to benevolence, or the power to act on behalf of another, because we can so often deny people their own inherent agency to act on their own behalf. As Guy Adams and Danny Balfour, scholars of public administration, dedicate an entire volume to this slippery slope in their book Unmasking Administrative Evil, now in its 5th edition. They study the ways in which, quote, ordinary people within their normal professional and administrative roles can engage in acts of evil without being aware that they are doing anything wrong, end quote. While I'm talking about evil, I'm going to drink out of my water bottle that says, "Not today, Satan." First, they point out that generally in society, we are hesitant to name systems as evil. And when we do, it tends to vilify the actions of an individual, like Charles Manson or Jeffrey Dahmer, without actually going into the cultures that produce men like that. Philosophers and theologians will talk about the concept of evil, but hesitate to name systems or actions as evil. When it comes to the ways that oppressive systems cause evil, we have a hard time naming it as such because those systems are made up of individual actors who, in the names of their professions, are just doing their jobs or just following orders. Individualism, Balfour and Adams say, is one of the core values of American culture. And here I would say American can also extend to Canadian since we hold so much, although not all, things in common. And it forms a barrier to our understanding of group and organizational dynamics and administrative evil. In our culture, we often assume that an individual's actions are freely and independently chosen, end quote. They go on to say that assumption blinds us to the ways that groups or organizations play a far greater role in shaping our behaviors and actions than we might otherwise assume. This gets tricky because compliance stems from the human need for order. Our political and legal systems provide the foundation for order through laws and norms and the like. Take the Geneva Conventions I already referenced. The creation of a relatively new framework in the 20th century of international laws are a positive outcome for our need to use political and legal systems for the good to govern the ways in which we form social contracts, if we follow them. Adams and Balfour note, however, that, quote, when public order is threatened, as it was in the post-9/11 United States, the response of the citizenry is a visceral one. The power of social motivation for the preservation of social order is fueled by a fear of chaotic conditions. This fundamental need for social order helps us in understanding just how strong the inclination to obey authority is for most people most of the time, end quote. If we think about the ways in which we are responding to social chaos in this moment, you can see it at play in the law and order approach to poverty. The social stigma against those entrenched in poverty and the resulting crime like petty crime that rises alongside poverty, combined with growing and rampant houselessness, is seen and judged as individual personal moral failing, and a punitive law and order approach is assumed to be a remedy for the confrontations presented when an unjust social and economic system creates visible and visceral signs that all is not right in our world. Without stopping to analyze the why of rises in petty crime, which when we think rationally and in a research-informed way, we know has a causal relationship with the rise of poverty, or poverty has a causal relationship with the rise of crime, or connecting the housing crisis as the natural outcome of a 21st century financialization of housing, which requires monetary policy reform in addition to massive amounts of investment in adequate housing supply. And here I say adequate housing supply, not just all housing supply. We instead judge the addicts we see on the street as somehow individually fallen, rather than as medicating their oppressed realities because, in effect, they have no other option. Because so much of our existence is governed by technical rationality, a mindset that prioritizes efficiency and controlled outcomes through the application of technology and process, rather than strategic and critical thinking, we forgo thinking critically the why of a situation and focus on how to fix it. We see this writ large in the increasing polarization and division that is creating so much pain in society, both here in North America and other places in the world. The result of what sociologist Saskia Sassen calls mass expulsions in her book entitled Expulsions, Brutality and Complexity in the Global Economy. These expulsions create chaos, anxiety, and pain, which can turn into unintegrated aggression and rage. Our institutions can use this reality of fear and struggle to create an oversimplification. And I want to share a lengthier quote from their text to explain how that works. The belief system or ideology, they say, that is manifested by the organization or polity gives the anxiety, which results from the unintegrated aggression, a name, and mitigates it by making it less confusing whom to love and whom to hate. In essence, the organization or polity communicates some version of the following to its individual members. You really are being persecuted. Let me help you by naming your persecutors and telling you who your true friends are, friends who are also being attacked by these persecutors. Together, you and your friends can fight the persecutors and praise each other's righteousness, which will help you to realize that the source of aggression and evil is out there in the real world, and you thought it was all in your head. You could take that as like the framework for almost anything that comes out of the American president's mouth at this moment. They go on to say the organization or polity has reduced the members' anxiety, but reinforced the splitting off of the bad objects and the projective identification. Thus, the unintegrated hatred and aggression that is the source of evil is called out and given organization and direction. This dynamic may be as benign as an amateur softball team that makes its rival teams into enemies. And I cannot tell you how deeply uncomfortable I am when I'm in my happy place in the Sky Dome in Toronto watching the Blue Jays game, and the Toronto fans boo every time the opposing team gets a home run. It drives me crazy because it's the starting point of this. However, when combined with moral inversion, in which the bad becomes good, this dynamic can lead to eruptions of evil. To seek to destroy the bad objects with all the hatred and aggression at one's command becomes good, because doing so protects the self from badness. End quote. This, I fear, exacerbated by digital lives that are governed by algorithms designed to predict more of the same based on users' interactions with particular content, means that our political spectrum is finding itself pushed further and further into poles. It's easy, because of the effective distance from alt-right perspectives, to see this happening in Trump's MAGA America. We can all see it. And I believe it does start off as benign, but it's going back to Tillich again, a slippery slope. What we often don't acknowledge, if we're not that far down the radicalization spectrum, because it's hard to see, is when it happens on our own side of the spectrum. This week, there's viral internet content alleging that Bob Dylan posted on the murder of Charlie Kirk, quote, "If you want people to speak kindly after you're gone, speak kindly when you're alive," end quote. And that faced with a so-called powder keg reaction of the internet on those words, that he doubled down, refusing to take down his post, which in fact he never posted, saying, "Now more than ever, it's important to be kind." This post-truth war for clicks and likes and virality is driven by monetization of information and a desire to create an emotional reaction to the dangers of the political other. Never mind the post-truth era implications of this phenomenon. I see this false content being reposted time and again by my liberal friends and colleagues because it reduces their anxiety the anxiety of democratic socialists by giving someone a name as a bad guy, in this case, implicitly reinforcing the narrative that Charlie Kirk got some kind of karmic outcome for his political and religious views. Living through the post-truth era in the digital age is its own beast, and not something I have the time to go into in depth here, but I will give a shout out to my colleague and friend, John Tatamanel of Union Theological Seminary, who I know is working on this topic and for a general readership. So keep that name in your mind and start watching the bookshelves for a book on post-truth and why religion is important in a post-truth era. We are living in dangerous, difficult, and polarizing times, my friends. But this is where I find hope in both the mid-century political theologians, my own Indigenous culture, and a commitment to become an intentionally intercultural church. In 1995, Metz and Moltmann published together a set of their essays in the volume Faith and the Future, Essays on Theology, Solidarity, and Modernity. In his first essay in that volume, The Future in the Memory of Suffering, Metz argues, there we go. It froze up for a second. Metz argues that confidence in the supposed gradual evolution of technical civilization is gone. If progress exists at all, it is only in opposition to its naive generalization, as in some crude futurologies. Imagine him writing that 30 years ago and how much more technological progression we've had since then. One can be grateful that Metz didn't live to see the digital hellscape that we're living through now. But I digress. Metz argues about the value of the memory of suffering that exists in Judaism through the Exodus story and liberation from slavery, and Christianity through the Passion of the Christ. He argues, quote, "The memory of suffering brings a new moral imagination to political life, a new vision of others' suffering that should mature into a generous, uncalculating partisanship on behalf of the weak and unrepresented. Hence, the Christian memory of suffering can become, alongside other often subversive, innovative factors in our society, the ferment for that new politics we are seeking on behalf of our future. This, in my view, is the liberative potential of the Christian story. When we see the crucifixion played out again and again in mass expulsions of human beings, whether individuals or groups, from systems that serve the so-called market or geopolitics or the algorithm, whatever organization or polity is driving those expulsions, we have a moral obligation to unmask the factors at work and to name it as evil and to resist it. The memory of suffering results in the ability to see the crucified God, to see the test of Auschwitz, and to work towards our collective liberation in a way that centers the experience of those made most marginal. I don't want us to miss the word partisan in his thoughts here, that we must engage in uncalculating partisanship on behalf of the weak and underrepresented. This means we must truly examine ourselves, our benevolence, our actions, and ensure that we are not on the slippery slope of sin when we don't allow others their own agency, but act on behalf of the other, however innocently. So much of public policy, the civil institutions we use to govern ourselves, in the systems and structures that make human social life easier, are encouraged to be nonpartisan. And we mean this in terms of partisanship as it relates to political parties, although that's increasingly debatable these days. But this is exactly how administrative evil functions. When we expect our corporate actions, either public or private, as in civil service or market-based corporations, to be nonpartisan and apolitical, it provides the disengagement and distance from the impacts of our cumulative actions on those disengaged decisions. But the reverse is also true. Too much crusading for a partisan position exacerbates the problem. And Aldous Huxley wrote in 1952, "The effects which follow too constant and intense a concentration upon evil are always disastrous. Those who crusade not for God in themselves, but against the devil in others, never succeed in making the world better, but leave it either as it was, or sometimes even perceptibly worse than it was before the crusade began. By thinking primarily of evil, we tend, however excellent in our intentions, to create occasions for evil to manifest itself." And that's what I'm talking about, like those of us on the left who want to demonize the alt-right neighbors and family members that we find it so challenging to love in this moment. We're doing the same thing, and it's just creating this reinforcing feedback loop. In my view, too much of our current socio-political reality is focused on demonization of the other, which is resulting in moral inversion and increased polarization. And it's tough, given the way that we receive information, and specifically the ubiquity of deregulated information on the internet and on TV, to combat radicalization and dehumanization of the other. Metz encourages us in his article, Messianic or Bourgeois Religion, that, quote, "To change states of affairs is said not to be the concern of the gospel and not the business of the church, which seeks to change hearts." This is true and false at once. The moving of hearts is, in fact, the first step to the messianic future. It is the most radical and most demanding form of reversal and revolution. And it is so because changing states of affairs never changes all that really needs to be changed. However, this also means that this change of heart is certainly not an invisible, or as people like to say, purely inward process. If we are to trust the gospel testimonies, it goes through people like a shock, reaches deep down into the direction of their lives, into their established system of needs, and so finally into the states of affairs which that helps to shape. It damages and disrupts one's own interests and aims at a revision of familiar practice, end quote. Love, in particular messianic love, is the story we need to tell to change the hearts of our neighbors and communities. And, like his arguments for an uncalculating partisan commitment to those made most marginal, he says, messianic love is partisan. There was certainly a privileged group around Jesus, those who were otherwise underprivileged. The universality of his love does not consist in a refusal to take sides, but in the way it takes sides. without hate or personal hostility, even to the folly of the cross. One of the most impactful accomplishments of Lutheran Dietrich Bonhoeffer's ministry, besides his prophetic resistance to the Nazi regime, was to establish a renewed type of discipleship in theological education. That living and worshiping together while undertaking theological study needed to be grounded in discipleship. And he wrote a little volume called Life Together as a detailed account of how he and his seminarians became a community, bonded through their community of common faith and mutual service in preparation for ministry. Bonhoeffer adamantly contended that the strength and objectivity to preach the word of the Gospels came from the common life of seminarians, their life together, as opposed to pastoral actions to isolated individuals. And he argued that Christian life and the faith can never be lived in the abstract. He stressed, as he had in his earlier writing, that relationships were augmented in their compassion and care for each other, that seminarians came, quote, not to be only with one another, but more especially to live for one another. I love this idea. I think that we have become very good at gathering to be with one another, but we have lost the intimacy and vulnerability and courage required to really live for one another. Bonhoeffer believed that it is by God's grace that a congregation is permitted to gather visibly around God's word and sacrament in this world, that they know that visible community is an expression of grace, and that the physical presence of other Christians is a source of incomparable joy and strength to the believer. I remembered back to my own early days in theological training. The Reverend Dr. Thomas Harding taught my class on liturgy and the sacraments. And in the first class, so backstory to this, my grandfather was a United Church minister and professor of homiletics. And in my first year of my MDiv, he said, "Who are you studying liturgy with?" And I said, "Oh, his name is Richard Leggett." And he sort of furrowed his brow and he said, "Oh, I don't know him, but I am getting quite old. I don't know all the faculty anymore." And I said, "Well, Grandpa, I don't know that you would know him. He's Anglican." "You're taking liturgy with an Anglican?" And I was like, "It's my first year's Intro to Christian Worship, I guess. Maybe later I'll study with a United Church professor." So I was deeply relieved the next year when Richard went on sabbatical and I got to have a United Church professor of liturgy to make my grandpa happy. So Thomas starts the first class by saying, "What's a sacrament?" Everybody's hands go up. "Baptism and Eucharist. A+. "Well, what else can be a sacrament?" All the Anglicans put up their hands and named all of the Roman Catholic remaining sacraments. He's like, "Sure, great, good ecumenism. What else is a sacrament?" Like puzzled looks, dead silent in the class. He's like, "What else could be sacramental?" More silence. Finally, my dear friend Carrie Ann Sheldrup put up her hand very gingerly and said, "Sometimes I feel like breathing is a sacrament." Yes, breathing is sacramental. Moving our bodies is sacramental. Walking in the forest is sacramental. Sex is sacramental. And you can see all the Presbyterians and Anglicans shrink down in their chairs like, "Oh my God, I'm in the wrong class." The impression I get from Bonhoeffer is that because Christian community is an expression of grace, it is also sacramental. I want to encourage you to do an exercise, and I've done this in the church. Kind of thought experiment, if you will. Let's everyone put your body in a way that feels grounded to you, whether that's feet or other parts of your body pressed to the floor or your chair, and close your eyes if you feel safe. Take a deep breath and another one. Keep breathing in slowly and out slowly. And as you become aware of your groundedness and of your breath, I want you to imagine the precious gift of sacramentality. When you have participated in witnessing or performing a baptism. If you're Christian, when we gather together at table. If you practice another religious tradition, when you participate in ritual. Or when you have a poignant moment with family. We believe collectively that these are physical signs of God's invisible grace. And what if we treated each other the same way? Keep your eyes closed, keep grounded, keep breathing. Now reflect on the quality of your relationships in your church context or your work context or another context of community. How much do you really know your neighbor? Are you busy doing things with your people? Or have you figured out how to live for them? When you look at your neighbor, whether you like them or not, do you see grace? Do you see the gift that God has presented to you in the people around you? Or do you take it for granted? Do you share your faith with these people? Not just in liturgy, but in everyday conversation? In bearing your deepest fears and hardest struggles so that others might know you, like really know you? Do you share the depth of your experience and strength and hope and the ways that spirituality affects your life? You can open your eyes. Bonhoeffer writes that when people are deeply affected by the word, they tell it to other people. God has willed that we should seek and find God's living word in the testimony of other Christians, in the mouths of other human beings. Therefore, Christians need other Christians who speak God's word to them. My assumption, if you're anything like me, if you paid attention to your body during the closed eye exercise we just did, you might have noticed two different things happen in your body. When you imagine sacraments and sacramentality, you might have felt your body relax and a deep sense of emotional wellness about the things that are important to you. But when I asked you to be honest about whether or not you connect so deeply with other people around you, you may have had a sinking feeling in your stomach or some of your muscles constrict. We don't hold each other in the same high regard as we do our rituals and our sacraments. We do not see each other as humans, as sacramental. Sociologist and thought leader Brene Brown said in her Netflix special that everyone has a story that will break your heart. And if you really listen, everyone has a story that will bring you to your knees. What if we did that? Like, really did that? It's hard. Lord knows, if you ask Cameron, who's traveled around the country with me for the last 2 years, and other people in the church who have known me for the nearly 2 decades since I went into ministry, there are folks about whom I'd rather not know. There are folks whom I'd rather not look at with sacramental reverence. They get under my skin. I get annoyed. I get judgy. If you really knew me, you'd know sometimes I swear like a trucker. Sorry, Mom. So I say things that are sometimes unkind, not at others, but in a way that could be offensive to some, and I know that. And I hide behind the changing social conditions that say that kind of salty bravado is okay, maybe even a little revered. But when I do that, when any of us do that, we rob ourselves of the real work of doing discipleship with empathy and authenticity so that we might live in Christian community with each other as if we really lived for each other. And that includes our neighbors, especially the ones we disagree with. Metz preaches messianic love, and Bonhoeffer asks us to practice a radically inclusive practice of gratitude, so profound and so intimate that I would know my neighbor so well and so fully that their prayers of intercession on their hearts would become my prayers of intercession. That is the opposite of the dehumanization that results from polarization, moral inversion, and the detachment of administrative evil. And it's what's possible when we truly practice a commitment to becoming intercultural. And I think it's important to really get into the behavioral norms and commitments that come from such a vision. And so in closing, I want to share with you the ways that's spelled out by the United Church at this time. An intercultural church is a welcoming church. It is joyful, accepting, and life-giving. It trusts that God's Spirit opens us to new experiences. It recognizes that those experiences can be challenging, painful, or uncomfortable. In referring to God, it uses a range of names and images. In writing policies and making statements, it uses many different images and ways of speaking. It is committed to listening and learning, not to just speaking and teaching. It invites full participation and dialogue. It allows itself to be changed. An intercultural church is a relational church. It treasures the different contexts that God gives to different communities. It values diverse expressions of faith. It offers a positive vision of the whole community together in its diversity, and it encourages a healthy critique of each other's point of view. It values the give and take of respectful relationships. It commits to building right relationship with all of creation. It takes steps to become a multilingual community. An intercultural church is an adaptive church. It is able, with God's grace, to accept mistakes. It learns from the past and grows. It is open to being vulnerable. It affirms diverse cultural identities and avoids their assimilation into the dominant culture. And this is a real bugaboo for me. I absolutely cringe when I hear people say all are welcome here. No matter who you are, no matter where you are in your journey, no matter who you love, you are welcome here, which to me says you're welcome to come and be like us. I would rather that we said you are welcome not no matter who you are, but because of who you are. And that we've anticipated the inclusion of the other so much that this space was designed with you in mind. Anyway, that's a different way. It dares to engage in an ongoing transformation of heart, mind, structure, and policy. It adapts to change when change is called for. An intercultural church is a justice-seeking church. It keeps finding new ways to share resources, redress imbalances of power, and challenge unfair systems. It seeks the equitable participation of all, both inside and outside of the church. It faithfully addresses racism and white privilege. It recognizes the church's participation in historic injustices, and it strives to do things differently. Just as an aside, and because tomorrow is TRC Day in Canada, I think it's worth sharing a superb example of being an adaptive, relational, and justice-seeking church in action. There was, during a discussion of a proposal that asked for the church to consider an updated apology for operating Indian residential schools in a post-Kamloops context at our General Council 45 in August this year. During the presentation by someone from the Pacific Mountain region that had developed the proposal, a commissioner got up and challenged whether or not there was any reason to actually believe that there were any unmarked burials in Kamloops or anywhere else in the country. The person presenting, who happens to be one of my very dear and best friends, and who is non-Indigenous, sort of froze in the moment and fumbled her way through an answer until the next intervention from a different microphone. And not long after that part of the agenda, she requested a point of personal privilege, which took precedence over whatever was on the agenda at that point. She said that when she had returned to her table group, she sat with the uneasiness that she had felt when she was at the podium. She realized that she had let her white fragility and fear as a non-Indigenous person immobilize her, but that what she really wanted to say, and that what it was important for the church to always say, is that we simply believe survivors and their descendants, always. Full stop. Because that is what reconciliation and repentance looks like, and that the social power dynamics of racism had silenced her in that moment. But her commitment was to reconciliation and confronting residential school denialism and white supremacy culture, and that she shared that learning as soon as she was aware of it in a way that was deeply courageous and vulnerable because it was the right thing to do. And she would not stay silent about it. It was her way of recognizing the church's history of injustice and doing things differently. And that's a big part of the reason why I love the Reverend Ingrid Brown. But back to the intercultural church. It thinks globally and commits itself to seeking justice. An intercultural church is an intentional church. It aims to be enriched by different experiences and points of view. It knows that we hold so much in common, but also have many differences. It provides a safe context for difficult conversations. It supports and encourages diverse leadership. This is especially important in communities that have been marginalized in the past. It examines itself, reflects, and keeps learning. It prays, educates, and consults. It monitors how well it is living out its intercultural vision. We don't do it perfectly. Those statements are all aspirational. But it's one of the things that I love about being a Christian and having this memory of suffering and being committed to the liberative message of being an Easter people, that death shall not forever overcome life. At an age where I was still in active discernment about a call to ministry, grappling with my indigeneity and how I could tolerate being Christian and Indigenous in the ways Christian and Indigenous, given the ways in which the colonialist drive co-opted the church for centuries. These words and commitments behind them were the emotional release valve I needed, along as well as being a source of hope that the church was trying, however fallibly, to be better. So here we are, 19 years later. The world is a raging dumpster fire. But if we can stop for a moment and aspire to this way of being with each other, to really know each other, to know our neighbors have stories that will break our hearts, to listen under the surface of ugly words that are said, and to get at that unintegrated aggression and anger that Adams and Balfour talk about. If we are uncalculatingly partisan in how we center the realities and impacts of our choices on those who are expelled from the systems of the powers that be, those made against people made most marginal in communities, that would be us living inside out for each other. An intercultural ministry can help us get there. Thank you. I should have worn my gold sneakers. I have gold leather sneakers. And I often would make a joke when I'd introduce myself and point out my gold leather sneakers, that if the Pope can wear red leather shoes, certainly the moderator of the United Church of Canada can wear gold leather shoes.
I was expecting the orange sneakers. Thank you, Carmen. You have had us confront our raw humanity and given us hope at the same time. So if you are moved by that, I invite you to go to the United Church website and search Carmen Lansdowne. And there are pages and pages and pages of letters and talks and lectures that are confronting these sticky social issues today. I haven't gotten through all of them, and I've been looking at them for years. And obviously her book is also on sale as well. But right now, we do have a few minutes that we could engage in some Q&A, and I'd invite our people online to put questions into the chat. I can see those and I'll speak them out for people here to hear. We don't have a microphone for the audience, but if there are questions here, you can also ask and I will translate into the mic so those online can hear that as well. So I'd invite you to bring forward your comments and your hearts to this conversation, broad conversation.
Thank you. In your presentation, there's a call to vulnerable when we call up these systems and to just step up to live with and for our neighbors. And you mentioned that that's sometimes really hard. And I think probably everyone in this room can relate to that. So where do you find the courage to do that and just to continue to step up and live that out?
So I'll just translate that for a minute. Sorry, I'm going to be back and forth here. So recognizing that unmasking project that you've asked us to engage in and to be vulnerable at the same time. And where do you find that courage to do that work?
I think it's tough because I think when you're dealing with someone who's like diametrically opposed to you, it requires a real posture of listening that we're not often that willing to engage in. There's a book I just read for a class that I'm teaching next semester. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of it, but it's about applying Bowen family systems to conflict. And it's based on the experience of a pastor in the Midwest. And he was newly called to a congregation in a mixed racialized and white neighborhood. And a race riot broke out in the high school. And it kind of spilled out of the school into the field, and the teachers were all like trying to separate the students, and some of the parents showed up, and there was the white parents were taken into one area and the black parents were taken into another area. And he and a couple of other pastors showed up, and they were like, what can we do? And they were like, go and be with the black families, because this kind of racism can't be tolerated in the school anymore. And he noticed, as he was watching all of the pieces being put into place, that all of the resources were being put into supporting the black students and the black parents. And so instead, he went and sat with the white parents, and he invited them to his church. And his colleagues were really mad, and they were like, no, you have to take like a stand, and you have to come and stand with the black community because they're traditionally marginalized. And so he sat with them and he listened until they kind of calmed down, and he got at the heart of what they wanted, which was that there was not enough resources in the school in terms of like students' academic achievement, in terms of access to like extracurricular activities, those kinds of things. And then he went and sat with the black parents, and the things that they were mad about were the same things. But the white parents' perception that the black students were getting all of the resources was reinforced by their experience of how the school had resolved this conflict. It gave them the perception that the black students were getting all the resources, when in fact they had many shared concerns about the lack of adequate resources for the school in general. And what was happening was that the two communities were fighting each other instead of advocating for what they wanted. And it took a period of months, and he really suffered a lot of marginalization within the ministerial in his area. But he said he just sat and listened, and he didn't agree. And there were some really heinous things that were said. But as people started to calm down, they made it less about the racial conflict and more about their concern for their kids. And then he started to say, do you know that the black parents feel the same way? Well, no, we didn't know that. And so he eventually was able to bring them together at a point where he had a couple of leaders on each side who could then keep the conversation focused on how do we positively get more access for our kids. And what they ended up doing was forming a parent society that then like swept the next municipal election, and a bunch of them got elected to the school board so that they could actually make the changes that they needed. But like in the moment, that polarization seemed to be about race, and it was not. It was about fighting for scarce resources. And all of the systems in the school were perpetuating the idea that it was a racial conflict. And that's how like the isms in our society rear their heads, is that when we're not naming the real issues and the real pains and the real hardships of our communities, then like people get disenfranchised and they start looking for the enemy. And then that's when those ugly messages are easily like creating these moral inversions. And, you know, when you look at what happened in the United States during the 2008 housing crisis, and the number of veterans that are dealing with like untreated PTSD from 20 years of war in the Middle East, and the number of people who are like, homelessness in Canada is very different than homelessness in the United States. There are cities of tens of thousands of people in major urban centers that are living in tents and are fully employed. They're not so incapacitated by their homelessness and resulting addiction and everything that they just are, on the streets and not able to function. Like they make enough money that they can still have a car or a transit pass. They have access to a gym membership so they can go to the gym and shower before work. Like they're living with like deep poverty, marginalization, and the world, like the system in the US doesn't work for them. And I have friends that used to work for a political consultancy that did like large scale qualitative insights at the depth of focus group at the scale of polling. And they did a study about the MAGA Republicans and why, when they held Christian values, why they could support somebody like Trump. And they said, we know he lies through his teeth. We know it's that he uses stuff that's not factual to rile us up. But he's telling our truth with a capital T that this system doesn't work for us. And they bought into the lie that he was going to protect them from the Democrats who had overseen the transition of lots of these things that were making their lives hard and painful. And so like when we don't see that underlying pain, when we don't see the fact that while we have lifted up women and girls and racialized people in our society without really thinking about how to do that alongside also lifting up white boys to tell them that they are also beautiful, wonderful, creative, and valued children of God. No wonder white boys are being radicalized to think that they're not important and that the woke society is out to get them. Right? Like we haven't done a good job. And we create these memes that say, more rights for me is not less rights for you. It's not pie. But in reality, the emotional messaging and the way that we treat each other and the way that we villainize each other's struggle is actually reinforcing that message. And so it takes being willing to sit with people who are not the same with you, who disagree with you. In 2022, I met somebody who worked for Canada-Israel Jewish Affairs. I have a history of being the co-chair of the Palestine-Israel Ecumenical Forum core group of the World Council of Churches. And as most people know, the United Church of Canada has become increasingly more vocal in its calls for justice for Palestinians. And when this person found out, he was in senior leadership, and when he found out that I was a candidate for moderator, he was like, oh, we need to talk. And I was like, I know. And so after I was elected, we went out for dinner a few times, and my whole purpose was like, I need to get to be friends with this guy so I can fight with him later. I'm serious. Like, I need to get to be friends with this guy so I can fight with him later. Because if this, like, the way that the Jewish community in Canada has sort of consolidated itself into this one organization that can claim it's the only national voice for Jews in Canada, which I'm not sure that that's totally accurate, but that's the way that they portray themselves. Like, I need to, as the leader of the biggest Protestant church in Canada, to be able to have a conversation with this guy when we disagree. And it's going to be way easier if we like each other as friends. Unfortunately, then October 7th happened. And we I signed a letter along with the national chair of the chair of the National Indigenous Council, saying that we're concerned that the potential for genocide would happen in Israel's response to October 7th. And this person's reaction was to text me and say, now that you've accused me of the worst crime possible, I can't possibly continue this relationship. And I wrote back to him and I said, I did not accuse you of genocide. My church raised a concern about the potential for genocide from the collective punishment that will come from the reaction to this horrific war crime that Palestinians have perpetrated in Israel. And that doesn't mean that my criticism of the state of Israel's actions means that I think that you are complicit. I don't see how not talking to each other is going to help. And I can't force you to be my friend, but please know that if you ever change your mind, I will be here. And I'm not like putting myself in harm's way. I'm not forcing anybody. I'm not like, chasing him to have a relationship. I just stated my truth, and I remain hopeful that one day we'll become friends so I can fight with him.
Online, there's, and this is just a comment that maybe afterwards they're very interested in the exact page numbers of that longer quote from Unmasking Admin Evil. So I feel like these are folks who are listening very carefully. And if I can add to this question, my own sense of university life, policies, administrations, trying to implement justice within short-term meetings. I'm looking at our administrators sitting here in the front row. It's difficult, isn't it, to have those heart conversations, to get to know people. That's a process. If you have any advice on how to do that with with policies, building community in a system that doesn't necessarily lend itself to that or value that as much as it does the bottom line, whether it's financial or making things operate in a timely way.
Okay, first, for the person who asked the
Page number?
question online, if it was the quote that ended with, to seek to destroy the bad object with all the hatred and aggression at one's command becomes good because doing so protects the self from badness, that came from page 24. I think that was the longest quote from that
Is
book.
that Andrea? Is that it? Okay. Yeah.
Super. I mean, I had a friend in my mid-20s who used to say about breakups that no matter how much you know it's going to hurt, it always hurts way, way more. And I feel that way about the work of indigenizing and decolonizing. No matter how long you think it's going to take, it's always going to take way, way longer. And part of that, I think, requires thinking far into the future, right? Like Cam mentioned that I introduced a lot of future thinking into the church through the flourishing workshops. And that was inspired by the work of Jane McGonigal, who is a futurist and game designer, who sort of discovered this sweet spot in her research that said that, like, if you can think 10 years into the future, you get to this sweet spot where it's close enough that the potential of the future feels tangible, like it's possible. It's not so far-fetched that you're thinking about like aliens flying around and like living with us in harmony on the earth. But it's far enough away that you don't feel the pressure of time. And that if we spend time visioning a future 10 years from now, where we think about like, what's the future I want to create? It becomes productive because you can conceive of the things that you can do between now and 10 years in the future that are actually tangible, and you can create milestones for yourself. Cam would maybe be happy to work with Jordan Cantwell, who's the growth animator in this region, to come and do that kind of work with you guys in Regina, because we designed that workshop in a way that it's sort of evergreen and it lives in the church, and it wasn't limited to the 13 times we did it while I was moderator. I think also like using Eisenhower's quadrant about like when are things urgent and important, because lots of times we assign urgency that things are not that important. And lots of times we put off things that are very important because they don't feel urgent. And so really using that matrix of like how urgent, how important something is, and just stop doing the work that's not important and not urgent if you can. Greg McEwen's book Essentialism is really great about that, like trying to actually say yes to the right things and say no to the right things so that you can make more time to say yes to the right things. But it might involve like iteration and trying things in a new way and saying like, oh, we tried to do this, it wasn't enough time, next time we have to plan for more time. Planning things farther into the future. I think because so much of our life is like digital and instant, we don't think far into the future. And it's really easy to plan a week-long retreat with your faculty when it's 18 months from now and everybody can like hold that time as sacred to actually get work like that done. But if you're always sort of just thinking on like a 3 or 3-month or a 6-month timeline or a semester timeline, it becomes harder to do that because you're faced with the pressures of all the things you've already scheduled. So I think also when you think of that metaphor of like you have a hurricane basin, you have sand and rocks and little like larger rocks. If you put the sand in first and then the medium-sized rocks in, and then you won't have space for the big rocks. But if those big rocks were the most important things, if you put those in the vase first and then put it in the medium rocks, then the sand will like filter it, all the other little unimportant things. You'll still find time to do those. And so I think it's just getting creative about how we plan, and also who's in the room, like being really aware of who is in the room and who's not in the room. I had a facilitator once who encouraged us to have a ghost chair. So like we have one here. This is for Elder Dr. Lorna. Like who should be in the room and involved in the discussion that's not here. That idea of thinking through creating space, whether it's physical space or gathered space, where you've considered who could be here and designing that with them in mind. Right? When we change our spaces to make them physically more accessible, like here we've designed the space with people who need wheelchairs in mind. How many of our spaces are not like that?
Thank you. Those are the concreteness of your answer is really appreciated. And I don't want to leave people thinking our administration is poor. We are super blessed by people asking these very questions.
I know this from eating two meals with them. There's a really deep commitment to thinking through exactly these types of things. It was not, I know that.
Are there other questions? We have time for one more, Leah. Yeah.
As someone who navigates and encounters and even uses the phrasing "all are welcome here" on a very regular basis, can you go a little bit further to unpack why that's problematic and how you would advise me to do better?
That's good. I'll translate for the folks online. That's a great question. So when we say all are welcome here and come and be part of this, and is there a different, you mentioned that is problematic. Could you give a little more detail on that and maybe some alternative ways for the sentiment that we want to have? Is that good, Leah? Okay.
Yeah. It's not always problematic. I was maybe being a little hyperbolic, but I think the challenge is we say that because it's based on our intentions and not that we've actually thought through who might the other be in this space, and have we actually created it to be a place of welcome for them. So for example, we say all are welcome here, but if the physical space is not accessible to somebody in a power chair, are all welcome here? If we say all are welcome here, but we treat new Canadians from West Africa who have a completely different experience of church and worship than how we do worship in North America, and they come in late and they talk through the service and they're greeting each other and they're listening and participating, but they're engaging in church in a way that is very different than your typical WASPy Canadian church. And then you have people who get disgruntled about that and come to the pastor and say, can you offer a class in worship etiquette so that those people can learn to be like us? It's not that they don't want the West Africans in their community, but they're only welcome if they're willing to conform to the way that worship is happening, instead of like, actually, maybe the blessing will be learning to actually have time where you could get to know your neighbor so that you could live for them, and maybe loosening up a little, right? Like there's so many ways that we can think through it. I had the privilege of serving as executive director at First United Church in the downtown east side, and one of the things we did was tear down our 1965 United Church special with a crown roof line that was a church designed for congregational worship, and it's really primarily an outreach ministry now. And the amount of intention and care that we put into the physical design of that space to make it accessible to people who are living rough on the streets now, and also realizing we were going to own this building for another 60 to 100 years, and that we have no idea to know how it might be used in the future, and try to future-proof it so that, if we didn't have to be having a food outreach program that could that be designed into a retail restaurant space later, or realizing that there was a growing number of racialized refugee folks who were homeless on the streets. We didn't put up any permanent cross in the chapel, and we had a medicine wheel laid out in the floor. So that was always there for First Nations folks who came from the east of the Rockies. But we also put a small green crescent oriented to Mecca inlaid in the floor and made space for prayer mats in the vestry. Right? That was designing a space for others in mind. Those people don't come to First United yet, certainly not to practice religious practices. But we thought, what if our ministry team could reach out to other faith practitioners and say, do you want to be doing interfaith, spiritual, like not interfaith, but like multi opportunities for faith for people who are experiencing homelessness, because we've created space that would be welcoming for you. We couldn't build ablution stations because that but we did actually have public showers that we could have shut down for 20 minutes before a prayer service so that people actually could do their ritual cleansing. Like we could find a compromise that would still be welcoming. So it's especially exciting, I think, when you're designing physical space. And so anytime you're going to renovate a space, but it's also wearing lipstick when you're preaching so that people who are listening to you or that are hard of hearing might have an easier time lip reading.
So there is one more question, and we're running a little bit late, but this is big, so I don't know how you're going to handle this in a couple minutes. But Kanana, you've got a really good question. Would you elaborate a bit about the statement you made, all Indigenous theology is political theology?
Sure.
Hmm?
Yeah. So in my book, I outline in general the very broad differences between Indigenous cultures in general in North America and like Euro-Christian ways of being in the world. And when it comes to the idea of history, the Western Academy has treated history as a discipline as sort of like a chronological telling of facts, and there's rules about what counts as like a factual record of things that can be taught. And in Indigenous ways of being, I think at this point most Canadians know that storytelling is a really important part, both of maintaining oral histories but also of teaching. And if you think of the purpose of Western history as being chronological and objective, the purpose of history in Indigenous ways of thinking is ethical and pedagogical. And so the facts of the story may change based on who you want to teach something to and why. Right? So it's not that we don't have such a disciplined way of saying this is true and that is not true, or this is factual and that is not factual, but we're telling stories for the particular purpose of teaching somebody how to be in the world and right relationship with each other or with a created order. And it's always relational, right? Like we're always thinking through our stories and those teachings as a way of holding each other to account for a right way of being in relationship with each other, which is really what politics tries to do, is to create structures and systems for us to be in relationship with each other. And so because of that orientation to the world, combined with the fact that we are so impacted by the political structures that like created colonization and continue to govern every aspect of Indigenous life, that you can't actually talk theologically about the world or life without talking about politics if you're Indigenous. That's the simplest way I can, but I go into that a lot in my book. I didn't at all tonight.
What a good segue for your book.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much for entertaining those questions. Just a few more pieces before we'll let you go. I'd like to invite our not so newly minted Dean, Dr. Derek Eberts, to offer a thank you and some closing remarks. And then after that, our pastor, Brooklyn Lane, will offer a prayer.
I do plan to keep this brief. After that just needs to soak in. It's a pleasure to thank Reverend Dr. Lansdowne Thank you, Carmen, for sharing your wisdom, your experience, your humor, your insights with us tonight. This was a talk we needed in a world where certain people in positions of great power increasingly seek to divide us. So this is timely. As a small liberal arts college informed by Christian values, this is where I would say Luther College, in a sense, stakes its territory, or let's say shares its territory. For us, the liberal arts are not a sort of nice to have when you can afford it. They're the heart of who we are and what we do, and what that means. Why that matters is because liberal arts, more than just being a collection of academic silos, which, by the way, it isn't, is about appreciating the value of different perspectives, about building community and relationships, and about cultivating empathy. Tomorrow is, as we've said many times already, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Another reminder of how important it is to appreciate the perspectives of those who we have historically othered, and to thoughtfully and meaningfully be in and create positive relationships. We do this by recognizing harms, not erasing them, by working for positive change, not turning inward and hoping someone else will fix everything for us. Our own Dr. Elder Lorna Standing Ready was not able to be here, as we've heard. If she had, she too would have shared a few words of wisdom, and I am not going to presume to do so for her, but there's something she almost always says whenever she speaks, and I think it's worth bringing here again. There is much work to do. That's one of the things you'll hear her say almost every time she speaks. And I would say, if I could, from what you've shared with us tonight, that work is going to require courage. And I think that's a challenge we should all accept. So enough of the words. We have a reception waiting for us. Thank you all for coming here to join this conversation, for supporting Luther College. I want to thank everyone here who was involved in making this lecture possible, particularly the committee members, Brenda Anderson, of course, our chair, Dr. Volker Greifenhagen, who is a member of the committee, our communications director, where is she there, Angela Bethune, and the one who did all the heavy lifting, really, where did she go? My EA, Samia Nareen, she's probably keeping quietly in the background. And I should also mention our IT support. He's also disappeared. Where did he go? Muiwa, who, as you heard when the mic was dropping in and out, he's on the spot, fixed it right there. We have a great group of people working with us here at Luther College. So again, and please again, join me in thanking the very Reverend Dr. Carmen Lansdowne.
If you have a prayer stance that resonates with your heart, I invite you to enter into it or just to simply be in the midst. Let us pray. Loving and gracious presence, one who has many names, thank you for this time of discussion, deep listening, and a brilliant lecture. We especially lift up gratitude for Reverend Dr. Carmen, for her passion, her energy, her heart, her clear, welcoming language. We give thanks for the way that she invited us to have a deep posture of listening. Her call to us to call out the systems of evil. Her invitation to see and think of the good and to not demonize the other. We lift these things up. We give you much thanks for this time. As we depart from this place, may we leave with a full heart, an inspired mind, and encouragement to turn ourselves inside out for each other, to live with and for our neighbor. And as we turn to tomorrow, Creator, may we reach out into the world in understanding, recognizing the humanity in each other, and seeking to walk the road of reconciliation hand in hand together. In the name of the compassionate one we pray. Amen.
Everyone, And the reception is ready for you, I believe, and safe journeys home. Thank you for coming. Yeah, that's something it's still there. Yeah. Yeah.